I'll try to get my point across. All right. Vikings chapter 4.
Vikings chapter 4.
Chapter 4. We're looking forward to it.
It's a very short chapter.
What?
In a very short book.
But a very long presentation.
No. Let me put it this way. Right here, we've got a third of the slides involved in this presentation.
Wow.
There was not a lot of information. Well, there was a lot of information given several times to fill up 10 pages. So, what are they doing to start with? So, from the 3rd to 11th centuries, inside Scandinavia here, there's very few actually permanent settlements. Every so often, just kind of depending on weather and the whims of local rulers, they will move just not super far, usually 5 to 10 miles away, and kind of set up a new settlement right down there. A town hall structure, which was kind of the one common thing in all of these, and it was basically one giant building that did every job besides be the house. Like, workshops were inside of it. It had the stables inside of it where all the cattle were kept. The main hall inside was the meeting place and where all religious ceremonies were performed. Probably in a little back room right behind this main hall.
Actual cave.
Yeah, it was an actual cave a few miles outside.
Get away from the family.
Exactly. And so everything was kind of just built around this, but the everything built around it was just the hovels that people lived in. And Roman goods were kind of like, were a show of class. If you had like Roman bowls and cups to drink out of, it was like a very high sign of
fancy.
Yeah, it was like using the fine china for every meal. Like, because you could afford for the fine china to get damaged. There was a big show of wealth.
Rich.
But it was interesting to note that some of the settlements, like there was one right up in here, and this is the Arctic Circle, right there. There was a settlement up here that was permanent during this time, and people just stayed there for some reason, and they were traders. And it said that they mostly dealt in reindeer.
Reindeer?
Yeah, so like they would trade antlers and furs and everything down to the people farther south.
Are you suggesting that they actually killed the reindeer?
It didn't say that, but I think that's preferable to cutting off the antlers and skinning them alive, which is the alternative.
How did they ever catch them when they're flying away?
Well, those reindeer never got caught.
Okay.
Because they're still kicking it on the North Pole.
With Santa.
Right.
Okay.
And also, one thing that the book noted that was pretty interesting was like this farthest northern settlement to the southern settlements here in Denmark, that distance is farther than from Denmark to Rome. And so, like, their own culture was spread across just a very long distance here in Scandinavia, but then they also were able to spread out from here and kind of influence everything. Because it wasn't an empire, it wasn't like one thing, but it was a common culture that covered this massive distance. And then what changes? The main thing that changes to make people settle down is the conversion to Christianity. The Catholic Church built, like the Catholics come and build stone churches, and you can't tear down your stone church every 15 to 100 years to move it, especially when some of the cathedrals the Catholics are building take a few hundred years just to build. And so they put stone churches across Scandinavia, and this is kind of like when an area becomes Christian is the last time any of the settlements move, because if they're not by where the church is built, they just move to where the church is, and then that's where the city has been from that point.
They go from, I think in the beginning they had wood churches, but then they actually started building stone churches.
When they convert to Christianity, they start building the stone churches.
And then that's it.
And then
no
more.
It's kind of like when a guy tells me he's getting married.
Yeah, you don't move around
changes,
anymore after that.
Yeah, they say, hey, yeah, we'll hang out, but you never do.
Probably not. That's what I'm anticipating. This is recorded. Gonna stop that.
It is recorded. Recording again.
It's recording again. I wasn't talking about my upcoming marriage. So the halls become less and less common as we see a more feudal type of society develop after Christianity spreads, and it starts to look like what the rest of Europe looks like. There's a king, and he owns all the land, and he gives it to serfs. It noted that there was besides the one in the Arctic Circle, there was really only one other permanent settlement in Denmark, where it stayed in the same place for 300 years, which was the longest that any place stayed in one spot, but it didn't have the big town hall. It was just farmers, and the evidence points towards them being serfs. There was no one there who actually owned the land. They were tied to it, like in the feudal system. And that is how towns started in Scandinavia.
That's
it.
That's it.
That was...
All right.
All right, so I did chapter 6. It's called Across the Ocean. Okay. So, this section was titled Pagans of the Sea. This was a term given to the Vikings by the monks that they were raiding during the time. So a lot of the first half of this chapter is about boats that they find. Very awesome. So the first boat was found in 1880. It was discovered in Gokstad, Norway, and it basically confirmed what people thought about the Vikings being in these big, awesome boats. And, this thing's not on. Now it's on.
Okay, try it.
So that is the Gokstad boat that they excavated. In 1904, they found another boat buried in Osberg. This ship was kind of state of the art for what they knew, because you could take out the mast and lay it down. So in case you were going under a bridge or something, you could just okay, we're just going to row for a hot minute. But it was also very artistic and ornate. So they found, they later assumed it was a burial ship for a princess. And then this is it right here. You can see how it has the kind of fancy little curly tip. The mast in the middle would have come out. And it said that this can hold up to 30 people, but that's a crammed 30 people. That's not a comfortable ride by any means. And then in 1957, 5 ships were found in Skuldev. In 3 different forms. So these are some of the ships.
Last summer I took students outside. I was teaching about Vikings.
Okay.
And they had a double wide sidewalk. And we took chalk and we measured out how long it was, how wide it was. Basically about as wide as a double sidewalk. And how long it was. And I had all the students line up in there so you can get an idea. Yes, it is crowded.
Yeah. So, the second ship they discovered was a huge ship by the means of the other ones that they had found. It could carry 60, 80 men plus booty. I don't know why I didn't say just treasure, but we'll talk about that later. The age of the ship proved that it couldn't have been built in Scandinavia. The rings on the wood they were consistent with the trees in Dublin. So they were okay, it's from Dublin. It was probably a mercenary ship, and it was a slave trading ship. In 97, so 97 kids, woo, the 6th ship was found, and it was just as big, if not bigger, and it was assumed to be a royal ship because of the wood that was used, the amount of iron, and just decorative things on it. And then there was another set of ships that was found at Hedeby Bay, and they were basically like in front of a fjord, and behind that were some royal areas. So they were like they're basically protecting it, and then they sank. And then Hedeby 2 was they thought it was a Slavic or a Saxon ship because nothing about the boat seemed to be original to what was on it. Like the flooring on it had been taken off another boat, and the iron was too big for it, so they thought it was from a larger boat as well. So this is a big map. So the first 2 ships were found like right here in Roskilde, like right where the laser's at. And then some other ships the other ones were found here. So this is like Denmark area, and then this is like Sweden and Finland. So, the whole Scandinavia area. These pictures are really blurry, but that's because there were no real good pictures. This one up here was the Hedeby 1 that was assumed to be a royal prince's ship or princesses or royal ship in general. And then this one was a Saxon ship, and you can see, like, even though it's very blurry and this really isn't a ship, it's like the remains of the ship, you can still see that, like, they're very different in the looks. Like, even from, if you look at the bottom one and then compare it to, like, these 2, they look very differently just in their, like, the fronts of the boat. I'm not a nautical person. I don't know the proper terms. So a few things that were just really important about the ships were all the ships during this time were very different, and they had very different uses. But depending on how nice it was obviously dependent on the investment that they put into it. So if it was just going to be okay, we're going from point A to B, it's not going to be something nice. But if you're about to go raid Ireland, you're going to have a nice boat because you got to carry back all your silver. Sailing was super important for the Scandinavians just because most of the people they wanted to trade with were across the sea. So if they didn't have a way to get there, they were just kind of well, we're just going to live here and kind of hate our lives. Some boats were used as feasting places. So they would dock the boat and they'd just be potluck. But yeah, so into overseas expansion, the underlying factor was scarce resources and population growth. Many Vikings were looking for wealth and land because that's what everybody wants to show power, and it was also the start of the Iron Age. So many things in the Iron Age were based upon gifts, and later on Viking status became based off of wealth. So if I was rich, I would give out rings was the big thing. And you were expected, if you were a weaker power and there was someone in your region that was a stronger power, you were expected to give them gifts. If not, they're going to make you give a gift. So it says, strong leaders were known as ring givers. So these could either be your typical, not a wedding band, but ring, or it could be this giant arm ring. I wish I found a picture, but I only saw one and it wasn't very good, but literally a massive ring around your arm. So the Hiberno Norse Vikings were expelled from Dublin in the late 900s, early 10,000 or not 10,000s, thousands. But they took this chest that was had over 10,000 pieces of silver in it, and this is what some of them looked like, and they buried it, but were never able to get back to it. Which, why do you bury something but not go back to it? But an estimated 40 kilograms of silver was on the chest, which was acquired through trading with people and then just pillaging and raiding. Later on, as Muslim influence spread across Europe, the Scandinavians just started playing a huge role because many people wouldn't trade with with the Muslims, or they would just close off supply lines. So they opened a lot through the Baltic Sea and then through Russia. And as in any good economy, they took away social interactions and economic interactions, and they made them completely separate because you don't want to mix your business and your pleasure. That just leads to bad things. As time went on, land became more important to the Vikings than portable wealth, and Viking leaders were easy to seize. It was easy for them to seize land just because they would look and see, okay, this place is already mad at this group, so we're going to make them even more mad until they fight, and we're basically going to come in and clean up. And we're going to take charge. In Western Europe, they were known to raid small towns and monasteries before the winter storm would hit. Raids happened in England, Ireland, and their Carolingian Empire, and then obviously the modern day Netherlands. Armies were quick to exploit rivalries between towns and empires. The Vikings got 7,000 pounds. So after Louis the Pious died, his sons, as we learned, were fighting for power in Francia. So the Vikings were like, okay, we're going to come attack France while y'all are deciding who's in power. And for not attacking France, they got 7,000 pounds in silver, which is pretty good settling. And then in 850, this was the first time where Viking attacks became more steady and consistent. And it was also the same time where the first example of a Viking burial was seen. This is a map that I had. Oh, nice. So from here, this would be a lot of where the trade routes were. And then this is also where they have found Scandinavian or Viking ruins, pottery, things like that. So it got all the way out into Kiev, was the farthest I wrote about in the book, or I saw in the book, which is really far. That's some distance to cover. I don't know about any of this. It didn't say anything about that in the book. But a lot of raiding went along here, a lot of raiding here, just the good places. Easy to access, near water. So then in expansion in the east, there were two main points of how cities were founded. So there was the Normanist view, which was big European cities had Scandinavian origins, and anti-Normanist views that had Slavic or other origins to them. Like I said, many exotic Eastern objects were found in Scandinavian countries. So there would be times where it was found. There would be I'm trying to think of something from Eastern objects, but there would be something found in a Scandinavian country. So it begs the question how far east did they go? Then it talked about what were the Vikings really doing? Were they just looting? Were they protecting people, trading, or was it a tribute? So Arabic text referred to a group known as the Rus, and they were fur and slave traders in the Bulgar region, and they were assumed to be Scandinavian people. But then in another context, the Constantinian emperor had bodyguards composed of Scandinavian mercenaries. I think there was 30 of them. So they were literally just there to protect him. And then more Viking rituals or burials were found all throughout Russia. So on the map, out here there were some burials. See, boats. That's what the burials mean. I wish there was a key, but not all maps have keys. And it's not letting me click forward, so I think I'm done. I'm done.
You're done. Okay. Thank you. These boats were actually very low draft, so they could go up rivers. This was part of the key. And they were also flexible. So they went across the ocean, they could bend with the waves. They would often tie ropes around them. And the navigation we haven't even talked about yet. Maybe someone will. All right, let me pause this. Okay. England and the Danelaw.
Yeah, so my chapter was on the Scandinavian settlements in England in the early Middle Ages. And I looked at the chapter and I was like, what? This is so boring. It gives the most bare bones information and only talks about these towns. So I'm just like, screw this book. And then I went out and looked for some other books that roughly talked about the same time period. And I was like, you know what? This sounds a lot better. I'll talk about this. So I'm talking about the creation of England and how the Scandinavians were involved. So first thing to understand, though, is that the country we now know as England was not England at this time. It was 4 Anglo-Saxon kingdoms that were called Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. And really the only thing they had in common is that they were all Catholics and they all spoke English, or what was English back then. And there are 2 main sources for this time period. There's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which was written during this time period by the scribes of Wessex, and the book, the source book claims that historians are less inclined to accept them at face value as they provide a one-sided account of this period, but I think they are better than the Norse sagas, which were written about the Viking Age centuries later and mostly based on more on Norse myth and legend. So, really, when interpreting these events, it really comes down to who you believe more, and I believe the Saxons because they actually wrote it down while it was happening. So, moving on. So, Danish Vikingers had been raiding the coast of Anglo-Saxon Britain since the raid on Lindisfarne in 793, but things changed roughly 7 years later when a coalition of Danes and possibly Norwegians, who were led by Ivar the Boneless, landed in East Anglia for the purpose of all-out invasion. We do not know how big this army was exactly, but it was certainly in the thousands if they could threaten all 4 kingdoms. So they landed in East Anglia in 865 and quickly began conquering all of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The chronicles do not specify a reason as to why they started doing this, but it was likely motivated by a lack of sufficient farmland in Scandinavia. But by 874, the Danes had nearly conquered all of Northumbria and East Anglia and much of Mercia, partially because the Saxons were fighting each other as much as they were fighting the Danes. And as soon as they conquered these lands, the Danish communities began settling and began mixing in with the Saxons. So as a result, Wessex was the last Anglo-Saxon kingdom left standing. And however, the Danes had first invaded Wessex in 871. The West Saxons had called up all their reserve forces, but they struggled to resist the invasion. A book I read said that there were 9 listed battles in a single year that were named, and 8 of them were massive West Saxon defeats, though it gives no details as to how they happened. But the West Saxons were dealt a particularly grave blow when their king Ethelred died in battle or from wounds sustained from a battle, and he was succeeded by his brother Alfred. So, but fortune began to turn for the West Saxons when Alfred took control because the Great Heathen Army split up around 873. The chronicles say that Ivar the Boneless died around this year, and archaeologists believe that he might have been buried in a mass grave with many of his other warriors at a place called Repton. And it was at this place, supposedly, that the army split in half. One of the warlords, Halfdan, who was Ivar's brother, took his men back to Northumbria, where they settled down and started farming and all that. But the other two major leaders of the army, Ubba and Guthrum, decided to continue their war against Wessex. And yes, I did take their pictures from a TV show because there are no pictures of them. So, in 877, Alfred paid a Danegeld to Ubba and Guthrum and negotiated them to leave Wessex and never return. But then Ubba broke the truce when he sailed his fleet around the coast of Wessex and landed in the peninsula of it for a separate invasion. And once he landed there, he tried to capture a West Saxon fort called Sinuit, I think, but the Saxon garrison killed him and decimated his army. And not long after this happened, Guthrum then broke the truce that winter when he attacked the Wessex palace of Chippenham, presumably while they were having Christmas celebrations, which forced Guthrum to run into the nearby swamps with just a handful of men, where he started to regroup his forces. So from those marshlands of Atheny, the Saxons conducted their own Viking raids from the swamps, really. They would just go out at night, raid a Danish camp, kill as many people as possible, steal as many supplies, and then rush back into the marshlands before they could get caught. And they also began spreading word around as many loyal lords as they could to get their forces together so they could be an army again. And apparently it's rumored that they would also murder any lords who sold out to the Danes. So the Saxons were finally an effective fighting force in May of 878, sorry. Once again, we don't know how big they were, but certainly in the thousands. And once they were ready, they marched out of the marshlands and camped at a place called Ethandun, which archaeologists are not sure exactly where that is. But when Guthrum realized that they had finally come out to play, he brought his army down to try to defeat him. But instead, he was defeated and presumably lost thousands of his men. It was bad enough for him to finally surrender to Alfred, and the two of them signed a treaty that dictated that Guthrum could rule East Anglia as king on the condition that he became a Catholic. So, and that's essentially the gist of it, although the wars between the Saxons and the Danes continued for decades afterwards. But at about 892, after one invasion, the boundary between Saxon-ruled land and Danish-ruled land became more defined. Historians called the Danish-ruled land the Danelaw. It was essentially northeastern England. But over the decades, as the wars continued, the Anglo-Saxons were led by the Wessex royal family, which gradually conquered and assimilated the Danelaw. Alfred's son Edward conquered East Anglia, and his daughter Ethelfled became the ruler of Mercia. And so finally, at the end of all this time, Alfred's grandson Ethelstan conquered Northumbria in 927 and became the first king of a unified England. Northumbria briefly separated after his death and was ruled by a Norwegian king named Eric Bloodaxe. But after Eric Bloodaxe died, the Danelaw died with him, and it was just England. So the reasons I could come up with as to why the Anglo-Saxons eventually won were command and control, political maneuvering, and cultural assimilation. The Saxons controlled their land with a system of forts called boroughs that guarded all avenues of travel and could be used as staging areas for invasions into Danish territory. And they were pretty much the first castles in England, in the sense that whenever Danes would start raiding into the lands, they could just pull all the farmers into the walls and then wait for them to leave. And they also commanded their troops with conscripted militias called fyrds. And this was a lot more efficient than the Danes, because the Danes were not really organized. They were just a bunch of earls who all had their own men, and whenever they want to do something together, the earl would get with another earl and say, "Hey, you want to go raid this place?" And he'd be like, "Yeah." But each earl just did their own thing. They had no unified ruler. And the Saxons were also able to dominate them through political maneuvering. Alfred set the stage for success for his descendants with his skills in politics by securing peace with East Anglia and marrying his own daughter into Mercian nobility. And finally, the Danes who lived with the Catholic Anglo-Saxons largely began to convert to their religion and adopt their culture. And interesting enough, the Danish language also influenced the English language with words like they, them, their, knife, window, and slaughter. And yeah, I know, it's a weird one. And as the book notes, many towns in England today have adopted Norse-style names. And those are my sources.